All right, welcome APES class. This is going to be our first video lecture. This is going to be on chapter 1, and hopefully we're going to be able to do this for the entire amount of material we have to cover. These slideshows will get posted and uploaded, not just to my website, but I will make sure to email them out to you all specifically so that you have the files and you can access them at any time if you're not able to get to the website, or if it's something like a snow day or for some odd reason we aren't able to meet and get together because classes get changed. So we're going to start out talking about chapter 1, which is studying the state of our Earth. Now, as we go through this slideshow, feel free to pause and write down whatever I am saying if you need to, if you want to focus on what's on the slides, or if you need to focus on what I'm specifically telling you. Either way, make sure that you're not just copying down what's written on the slides, but also paying attention to anything I say that might sound important, be important, or may relate to any of the slides we have here. So your first slide says, how would you classify the state of the Earth today? And now we're talking about environmental science, and very few people would probably say that we are in what we'd call a good state or a stable state. But it'd be hard to find people that would say we're also in a poor state. We are in limbo. We are kind of in between in terms of, are we in a good place? Are we in a bad place? The general consensus is we are heading towards a bad point, but not so much so where we feel the urgency to do anything about it. Now, what classifies our Earth as being in a good state, a stable state, or a poor state are some environmental indicators that we're going to mention a little later on. Now, environmental science is important because it's not just studying the physical world around us. That would be earth science. So studying the air quality and the land use, and studying the water quality, looking at physical amounts of matter. That's earth science. And it's not just studying populations. It's not just studying communities. That would be biology and ecology. Environmental science is unique in that it takes all of that stuff and pushes it together. It's not just studying physical resources, natural resources we have on this planet, but it's also studying communities, people and animals and plants and all other types of life, and then putting it all together by saying, how do these things impact each other? What are the relationships that tie all of these things together? So when we're looking at environmental science in AP, we're really going to focus on what are the effects that our actions have. What have we done, and what will be the response to that? What is the response we will see? What is the response that's going to happen later on? So a couple of quick definitions just to know when we're talking about specific things. The environment, it's a very broad definition, but just the sum of all conditions surrounding us that influence life. And environmental science, obviously, studying all of the conditions surrounding us that influence life and looking at how we interact with nature and how nature interacts with us. Now, in terms of a system is a very base definition there, but what we care about is an ecosystem, because the ecosystem that we're talking about is looking at a particular place and looking at and factoring in how are the living and non-living components of that place tied into each other. You see from this little graphic here that what we have is, on this side, we have environmental, social sciences, and humanities. These are kinds of the things that don't always get thought of when we talk about environmental science, but they are wildly important, and especially for AP, a lot of questions will get asked on economics, policy, and law. Most of the time we tend to focus our environmental science, and because it is science, focuses on the physical and life sciences, the earth, the chemistry, the biology, the toxicology. But we are going to definitely have to incorporate at a different level than you might be used to how economics relates to our cause and effect, or when we do cost-benefit analysis, how politics and policy influences the way things are done and the actions that are taken. Now, some of this should seem like review, biotic and abiotic, so we won't spend too much time here, but just remember that seeing the term biotic means the living part of the earth, so plants, animals, anything that is underneath those characteristics of life, and the abiotic is the non-living stuff. That's the physical matter, the soil, the air, the water. Now, where environmental science, or at least in this class where we're going to focus, is when we talk about how we alter those natural systems, how we look at these ecosystems, and what are we actually doing to them? What is happening there? What are we doing? What kind of responses are happening? Now, it's no surprise and it's no shock that humans alter their environments. We've been doing it for hundreds, if not thousands of years, all the way back to your original hunter-gatherer societies. Now, we see the effects on land, but when we were in smaller groups, we didn't really have that much of an effect. However, as our populations have gotten bigger over time, it's been much, much easier to see how humans have impacted the world around them. You look at these couple of quick pictures here as an example, we see what looks like a desolate, very suburban area, followed by a very bustling big city. Now, what do these two pictures have in common? They were taken in the same place. The picture up here on the top left is the late 1800s Los Angeles area, and the picture here was taken in about 2010 of the same greater Los Angeles area. And we can see in just over 100 years, the amount of landscape change and changes that would come with it in terms of structure, infrastructure for roads and pipes and all of the and influx of people, how resources have to get diverted when we make great changes going from this to this here. Now, the big factor, the big overarching theme for us is going to be sustainability. Living on Earth in a way that allows us to use its resources without depriving future generations of those resources. If we can't live in a sustainable world, then it's going to have some kind of negative feedback. Now, the things that determine whether or not what we are doing is considered sustainable are some environmental indicators, basically some benchmarks, some things to look at, looking over your shoulder to say, hey, am I doing this right? Like if you were a little kid looking at mom or dad saying, do I do this? Do I do that? What do I do here? The environmental indicators are basically mom and dad for us. We look at them and we say, is what we're doing okay? And they give us a response and they tell us whether or not what we're doing is good or bad. So what are those environmental indicators? These are things that you definitely need to know because in all different areas, one of these 5 things or more in most cases are going to pop up and we're going to look at what's happening in that particular case. So the 5 things that we are going to look at as we go through environmental sciences here: biological diversity, all the way up from genetics to species to entire ecosystems. How diverse an area or a species or a population is can be an indicator, especially if the diversity changes in a way, mostly in a negative way. Food production, not just producing quantities of food, but producing food based on the amount of people or the amount of individuals that require said food. One of the ones we look at is average global surface temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. You can kind of get a sense that this has to deal more with climate change, and these are the indicators these are really the big indicators we'll look at when we're talking about climate change. Human population numbers specifically are a big environmental indicator on a global scale because they tell us not just how our own specific area is, but since human population spans the entire globe and not just a single area, we see how that population growth is going to be perceived and affected in different parts of the world. And last but certainly not least is resource depletion. How much of the stuff that we need, what are considered natural resources, are we using, and are we using it effectively? You can see here this table 1.2 is in your textbooks. Now, what I like about this and why this is a nice little thing to study is the fact that not only does it list all of the indicators, but this is what's really happened in the past, recent trends. So we see that in terms of biological diversity, we've had a large number of extinctions and extinction rate is increasing over time. That's not a good thing because a good indicator or an indicator of a good environment is a lot of biological diversity. That means there is room for things to grow and speciate. When we have a lot of diversity, that means we have an ecosystem that is not only supporting what's there, but also creating newer opportunities for new individuals and new populations. So what does that mean for the future? Well, if extinctions continue, we would say that that's probably a negative impact because if we start to lose populations that are essential to a specific ecosystem, that could cause varying problems. one of the big ones we're dealing with here in the United States is the loss of bees. And we know bees are very important because they pollinate flowers and they help flowers to bloom. And we know that flowers are important because they are plants. So while not on the same scale as large trees, they are still taking in carbon dioxide and producing new oxygen. So a loss of flowers and flowering plants could definitely have a negative impact on any environment. Food production, we see per capita production, we'll see in a couple of slides, has been starting to decrease even though the amount of food we've been producing has increased. So while the grand total has increased, the amount of food that is available per person has actually decreased in recent decades because our human population is still increasing. Now, those two things together produce a negative feedback cycle. The more people, the more food we need. The more food we need, the more people there are going to be. The more people, the more food. And eventually one of these two things is going to hit a breaking point. Food production will probably hit the breaking point before population because it has a greater effect on it. And since it's going to have a greater effect on it, once food production starts to really slow, we're going to see human population numbers start to slow off as well with that. In terms of these physical factors, these abiotic factors, surface temperature and CO2 concentrations, we know that they've been increasing, and while even scientists say that the effects are uncertain and very varied, the general feeling is that it cannot be good, that surface temperatures are rising and CO2 concentrations are increasing, because we know that if CO2 concentrations increase, they're going to keep our atmospheric temperatures higher by trapping in more energy, which will in turn create a greater surface temperature, and we know that with a greater global surface temperature, that cold things will start to melt, and we're starting to see that with glaciers and ice in the North and South Pole. Finally, last but not least, resource depletion. Many resources being depleted at rapid rates, and we'll talk about some of those resources specifically. The problem is not the use of them, the problem is that we're using them faster than they can regenerate, and that is where we start to encounter some issues. So in terms of biodiversity, we know that diversity means differences. So biodiversity, the differences or diversity of life. Now, genetic diversity, you might remember from biology being genetic differences within a population. Genetic differences are a good thing because genetic differences lead to natural selection playing out. Natural selection will allow a species to continue on, or a population to continue on, because the bigger, faster, or at least more well prepared or genetically advanced individuals will survive, and that spells good news for that individual population. For a specific species, when we're talking about species diversity, we're not talking about one species, we're talking about the number of species in a region. This is the big indicator that we're talking about when we're talking about biodiversity. It's how many different species live in an area. So not just animal species, but plant species, bacteria, bugs, insects, all different kinds of living things. The more species in an area, the better off that area is. When we start to see the number of species declining, that's usually a red flag. So when species start to die off, and when they start to leave areas, or when they start to not be found in areas, that's a red flag that something is going wrong in that area, and we need to investigate why. As far as food production, there's a slide. Yes, this is the big thing we want to look at here, is this slide. You notice by looking at this graph, and you're going to see that we're going to have a lot of graphs and charts and tables when possible, because on your AP exam, a good majority of multiple choice questions will test you on content, but will focus on graphs. Now, looking at this graph, you can pause it if you want to, but if you had to make a general summary about what's happening in this graph, you can look at it and say, well, time is always on our x-axis, and on our y-axis we have per capita grain production in kilograms. Now in 1950 it was about 250 kilograms of grain per person. That's what per capita means. And this is on a global scale. So 250 kilograms of grain per person in 1950. Right before 2010, where this data ends, about 2005, 2006, that number was over 300, which sounds like a good thing. So this seems to be trending upwards. The fact is we're producing more grain than we used to per person. That's not telling the whole story here. And this is the indicator, and this is where this indicator is useful, because where per capita grain spiked in the mid-80s, almost at 350 kilograms per person. It has gone down since then. It has fluctuated, but general trend has brought it down. And that's not a good thing because we have a lot more people. So while we are producing more grain, we do not have enough to support the number of people. What this leads to is rising costs of food and a change in the economics and the way that food is processed and distributed. And when people cannot afford food, or when food becomes too expensive, we start to see famines and hungers around the world, mostly hitting the more populated, impoverished, poorer areas of the world. For average global surface temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations, what we're really going to focus on when we get to this and when we're looking at this is the anthropogenic ones. Surface temperature changes, carbon dioxide concentration changes caused by human activities. That's what anthropogenic means. That's what we're really focusing on. These things do fluctuate in different time frames and different time periods over the course of history. But what we're focused on more is the things that we are doing, not necessarily the general changes. You can take a look here. We can see that this is basically a diagram of what happens, what this CO2, our very important greenhouse gas, is. The more we have of these, the more heat gets trapped, which is going to raise temperatures. And we see how carbon dioxide and global temperature here have a correlation. As carbon dioxide concentration has increased over time, so has global temperature. Now, looking at a graph like this, we have to look at it and say, well, the spikes and the rise seem to coincide with each other. So there must be a relationship between the two things there that we'll look at later this year. Human population, another big indicator because of how many people there are. We are over 7 billion right now, and that number is increasing on average with about 1 million additional people every 5 days. The more people we have, the more stress we will put on the environment, because we are going to deplete resources. That's why I bolded and underlined this statement here, because this is probably the big highlight statement of this lecture. As human population grows, the resources necessary for our survival become increasingly depleted. Now, some of our resources can be recycled, like aluminum, copper, but they exist in a finite amount, even though they can be recycled. Some of the ones that we have not found a way to recycle yet are the ones that we depend on the most: coal, oil, and uranium, which are responsible for creating power, electricity, and heat needed for human use, needed for production of goods. These are non-renewable. They cannot be renewed or reused at any. We have not found a way to at least reuse them yet. So they are very finite, and we are using them at a very quick, very alarming rate. Now, development affects how resources get used, and you can take a look at this chart as well and see that certain things are used in developed nations more than they are in developing nations. For example, a developed nation like the United States uses a lot more automobiles and trucks, which means we're using a lot more coal and oil in places where there are cars and trucks. Same with paper. Paper is not needed in a lot of developing nations, but it is in developed nations because we are more literate. There tends to be more literacy in a developed nation and less in a developing nation. So the use of paper is much more important, which means we are using more natural resources like cutting down forests and trees for that. We've mentioned Easter Island before, and we talked about Easter Island on Friday, and we know what happens when resource depletion affects a small localized population, as demonstrated by Easter Island, that it has the potential and the possibility to wipe out an entire population. So what does this all mean? Well, all of these things taken together mean we need to find a way, and we need to come up with a method in order to have sustainable development. Development means that we are still progressing as a society, but the sustainable portion means that we are doing it properly. We are doing it correctly. We see here, sustainable development could mean things, as it's defined here, balancing well-being with an economic advantage with resource management in order to benefit us. A very simple way is to look at things like using a bicycle. Bicycle will still get you from point A to point B, still benefiting the person in terms of getting them the desired job. While it does require more effort, it is for the better good of the individual, and not the individual, better good of the society, because now we are lowering or lessening our impact on fossil fuels because certain individuals are now taking themselves out of that equation. In order to live sustainably, couple of things have to happen. Systems must not be damaged beyond their ability to recover. We have damaged some systems, but they have not, at least to a certain point, reached a breaking point where we cannot change or we cannot fix what's happening. Renewable resources must not be depleted faster than they can regenerate. Unfortunately, we are very good at doing this. We are depleting things like coal and oil much faster than they can regenerate because we know it takes millions of years for them to regenerate. And our non-renewable resources, things like coal and oil, must be used sparingly. Again, we are not very good at doing that. And since we're not very good at doing that, we're going to need to find some alternative methods to basically either get these resources or get the production and goods we got from these resources previously. One of the questions that gets raised with this is what's called human need, defining human need. Do people need electricity? Do we need electricity? Do we need the internet? Technically, we don't need it to our survival. On a social and cultural level, yes, we'd say we do need electricity and we do need the internet because it's part of our daily lifestyle. It's become so ingrained in our lifestyle that without it, we might not be able to function. Now, we look at people in the developing world, poorer areas, and they don't even require this modern convenience. Many people don't require electricity or anything that we use on a daily basis. They, for the most part, still only require air, water, food, and shelter, which are what we define as basic human needs. These are the resources that we need to care for, but we are polluting our air and our water and our food and our shelter, our land, by using our resources towards things that are not considered necessities for life. Ecological footprint we will talk about a little more when we talk about ecology, but basically what the ecological footprint is, it's a way to look at how much of an impact does an individual have on their environment or even more generally on the earth. The bigger your ecological footprint is, the more damage you do to the area. In reality, we all want a small footprint. We all want to have a small ecological footprint because that means that we are using a smaller amount of resources given the amount of space that we occupy or the amount of space that we take up. So ideally, a small ecological footprint is what we want. Now this graphic is nice because it shows how the footprint relates to the scale of the Earth itself. So this seems like good. Yes, we're using our ecological footprint is equatable to the Earth itself. However, we don't realize that if the rest of the world had our lifestyles where we use an abundance of resources, we would overrun Earth's resources by a matter of fivefold. That's a problem because a lot of nations are starting to develop US lifestyles, or the average lifestyle here in the United States, and eventually we're going to hit a breaking point where the amount of resources aren't going to be able to meet demand. Now, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to carefully just flip through these slides for scientific method and process. You can look through them. You can choose to record, write down whatever you feel is necessary, but I will not be voicing over these things. Scientific method to you. This will serve as your review. You've been drilled with it in the past. I'm not going to go into too much depth and detail. I am going to just leave each of these slides up for a couple of seconds as we wrap up this presentation so that you can pause and write down whatever you want to or whatever you feel is necessary to record. So we remember observations, our hypothesis, how we collect data, and again, most of this should feel like review, interpreting our results. Difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning is actually pretty important in environmental science because we can only do so much deductive reasoning that we do have to do some inductive reasoning when we're applying isolated situations and experiments to our global environment and systems. Figure out disseminating findings. That's our analysis. What were we actually doing? We know that things that we want are usually going to be high accuracy, high precision. Low accuracy but high precision means that we did something right, but there was an error there. And if we have low precision, never usually a good thing. A couple of key things differences between theories and natural laws, controlled experiments and natural experiments. does raise an issue because one of the things we need to worry about is the fact that we don't have a control in environmental science. Flip back to this in case you didn't get a chance to pause. We don't have a control planet to compare, so experimental science in terms of natural sciences is an issue. We do have to look at isolating individual areas or cases or experiments and then trying to apply that data to the rest of the world. So that wraps up our first video lecture. I hope that it was not too unbearable. I hope that you guys will provide me with some feedback. I know I'm looking at the time here and I realize that it was a little bit long, but as far as I'm concerned, 25 minutes of lecture on a chapter is not terrible. We were able to get through it in terms of videoing. You have time now and to record notes at your leisure, watch this as much as you need to in terms of writing things down, and looking forward to seeing you all next time in class.